I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, the Labour opposition rises in support of the Westpac New Zealand bill, and if I might begin by acknowledging the member who has just spoken, the chairperson of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, Craig Foss. As I've said before, he does a very good job of managing that committee, Mr Chairman, and he certainly brought this bill through in good shape to the House. Mr Chairman, I think it is appropriate for us to run over quickly what the bill does, why it's there, the rules that it seeks to serve, which it sets out in the preamble that we're debating at the moment, why they are there, and the implications that that has for the broader context, which is the stability and security of the New Zealand financial system. Essentially what this bill does, Mr Chairman, is to provide a mechanism through Order in Council for the vesting of assets from Westpac New Zealand's institutional business, which are currently owned technically by Westpac Australia, to be vested in Westpac New Zealand. In doing so, sir, it is seeking to comply more fully with the local incorporation policy for systemically important banks, which has been set by the New Zealand Reserve Bank in consultation with its partners across the ditch, as they would say. This is special legislation which is being brought to the House because there is no other legislative vehicle available on the basis of testimony from the Reserve Bank and from Westpac which would allow that vesting to occur, and the Select Committee, sir, accepted that expert testimony. But why is the vesting occurring, sir? That is, sir, because the strategically important or systemically important banks in New Zealand are required by the New Zealand Reserve Bank to maintain a minimum threshold of assets and liabilities within the New Zealand legal domicile. And that is, sir, done by agreement with the Australian banking authorities to ensure that there is sufficient system stability in the New Zealand banking environment. Now, the counterfactual, sir, would be if there were not sufficient assets vested within the New Zealand domicile, that more of that backing would simply be, as it were, on loan from the parent across in Australia, and that brings with it certain system risk around the marginal status of a small market relative to its larger neighbour, and in times of crisis, as we've seen in 2008, 2009, the potential for risks to be higher on the smaller marginal market than they are on the parent market. Sir, I think it's a totally legitimate goal. It's agreed on a bipartisan basis across this House, and it's one which the Labour opposition will continue to support. In behind that goal, sir, as reflected in the preamble that we're debating, is the underlying concept that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand should be and will continue to be a full-service regulator which has responsibility both for price stability and monetary policy under the Reserve Bank Act and also for system stability, which is, if you like, the combined health and well-being of the financial ecosystem that is then able to provide credit on a sustainable and efficient basis to the businesses and households and corporations that make up this wonderful country. And so without the oversight of a full-service Reserve Bank, Mr Chairman, we would not have the same degree of stability and security for the New Zealand banking system. And it's a completely legitimate part of that, sir, that we would have a minimum threshold of assets and liabilities for each of the main banks. Well, sir, tomorrow's budget day. And so it is appropriate that this bill's coming to the House today by order of the government, because clearly they wish us to contemplate in the context of this bill the role and status of the financial system which this bank, Westpac New Zealand, is part of. And Mr Speaker, it's certainly the view of the Labour opposition that one of the crucial tests for tomorrow's budget will be whether it helps New Zealanders to save. Now, Westpac New Zealand, which I've recently had the pleasure of meeting at a senior level with and having discussions with, Westpac New Zealand strongly supports the KiwiSaver scheme, sir, and they do so because it's good business for them, and they in turn provide an efficient structure through which KiwiSaver accounts can be managed. And yes, that's absolutely relevant to the purpose. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
And so, sir, the preamble of the bill sets out the purpose of the bill, which is, of course, that we allow the Westpac New Zealand bill to provide for the vesting of assets and liabilities in Westpac Banking Corporation of New Zealand. And those assets include KiwiSaver accounts. Now, those assets have been growing rather rapidly, not only for Westpac, but for other members of the banking industry. They've been doing so, sir, because there have been healthy, we might say, incentives to encourage New Zealanders to place their savings with the scheme. Members get $1,000 when they join, and they get up to $1,024 per annum as a dollar-for-dollar tax write-off. So that's $20 a week for every $20 saved that people can set off against their tax. That was, sir, until last week, when the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister indicated that those benefits to working New Zealanders or saving New Zealanders would be reduced. And that has created outrage, sir, around New Zealand. The internet is full of it, our phone lines are full of it, our electorate offices are full of people wishing to register complaints that this government has broken its promise, sadly, and it is now moving to reduce the incentives in KiwiSaver again, because they reduced them in Budget 2009. And indeed, part of what is inhibiting Westpac New Zealand from fulfilling its commercial objectives, Mr. Benefit, is that Mr. Bennett, that's Ms. Benefit, Mr. Bennett, is that she is, and I'm not talking about dairying here, Mr. Bennett, not talking about dairying. So that's irrelevant for the purposes of this bill, and I'm going to contain myself to the bill, and I'm not going to the members' work in that industry. But sir, what's important with KiwiSaver is that it's predictable, that the public has confidence, and that Westpac New Zealand, like other banks, can continue to benefit from it. And when last year the government said that they were going to reduce the default contribution rate, and this year the big idea is that they're going to put it back to where it was last year before they changed it last time, Kiwis are going, why? Why? And why are you breaking your promise? Not you, sir, but why is the government breaking their promise not to reduce the benefits in the KiwiSaver scheme? But that's enough on KiwiSaver, because we wouldn't want members opposite to get too agitated about it. Let's consider another important backdrop to this bill, which is the health and well-being of the New Zealand banking industry. And it remains a fact that has shocked many New Zealanders that the 4 Australian banks domiciled in New Zealand make more profit and send it offshore each year than all the companies on the New Zealand Stock Exchange combined. The top 50, that is, yep, which is the NZX 50, was the exchange I was referring to, and that is not even close. So the big banks are very profitable. They've almost recovered back to full pre-crash profitability, and those profits go offshore. The consequences of that is when hard-working farmers and others are exporting their products, it is impossible virtually for us to make a current account surplus, even when we make a trade visible surplus, because the invisibles from the financial sector are always so negative that they overwhelm the poor old trade surplus. And stripping back those invisibles, that's the net investment balance, it's the cost of running the finance industry of which this healthy bank is a part. And sir, New Zealand deserves to spend some time considering how in our future we might own more of our own future by progressively boosting the New Zealand component of the finance industry so that we may progressively see a somewhat lower share of that profit and turnover being repatriated offshore. That's not going to happen overnight. It shouldn't disturb the normal competitive processes of the market, but the government does have an opportunity to stand behind that process by supporting, for example, the continued gearing up of Kiwi Bank's balance sheet and a Labour government certainly would. Mr Speaker, I want to refer to one other aspect which is important to Westpac New Zealand, which is that its institutional bank is able to play in the market for long-term securities, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman.
I call the honourable member David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I may not need to take the full 5 minutes, but I appreciate the opportunity just to round off. Thank you, Mr Chairman. And the third part of the financial and economic context here is really the increasingly important part in our financial ecosystem that is being played by the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. And, sir, in the context of this budget, it was very interesting to note the Crown accounts just released, sir, that project an OBEGAL, that's the operating balance before adjustments, gains and losses, which is $16 billion, but after those adjustments it's only about 10 from memory, 10 I think, and that difference is overwhelmingly driven by the improvement in the value of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund's investment portfolio. Now that's a good thing. It's a good thing that that's increased by 32% in the last year, or I think 8.3% since inception, not only taking into effect the last year, but all of the effects of the global financial crisis, and it's still almost double the rate of return than the Crown's cost of capital. In anybody's book, a good investment, except that the current government has refused to continue paying into that fund and has thereby prejudiced the government's future ability to afford superannuation at the current rate. So it's very difficult for me to square, Mr Chairman, how the government can talk the talk about increasing savings when they've undermined KiwiSaver 2 years in a row and they have refused to continue paying into the New Zealand superannuation. And that's important to Westpac. That's important to Westpac. It does have a lot to do with Westpac because Westpac's institutional bank is a partner with the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. Westpac which brings me to the next point. I'm glad Ms Adams raised this. The next point is that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, which sets the threshold, which requires the vesting being embodied in this bill, is also moving to adopt the Labour Party's monetary policy, which includes macro-prudential policies such as the core assets ratio, which just happens to be the key driver, or one of the key drivers, sorry, Mr Chairman, which requires banks to raise increasing amounts of their capital from domestic savings right here in New Zealand. And that, sir, in our book is a really healthy development because it makes us somewhat, not totally, but somewhat less vulnerable to the swings and roundabouts of bouncing exchange rates and provides an encouragement to domestic savers. So we want to acknowledge the wisdom of that. We want to compliment that act by the Reserve Bank. We want to note that the Labour Party's been advocating that publicly for at least the last 18 months, sir, and we believe that there's future potential to use that for counter-cyclical purposes. To sum up, Mr Chairman, and I appreciate the ability that you've given us to round this off, the Westpac New Zealand bill has bipartisan support. I imagine multi-partisan support. It does, sir, because it's a sensible move to allow the vesting of assets and liabilities in the New Zealand offshoot of Westpac International Banking Corporation, Westpac New Zealand. It does so pursuant to the requirements of the Reserve Bank, which are there for good reason, to ensure that local banks have enough assets and liabilities to underpin system security. We support that goal, we support the bill, and I'd like again to note the cooperative spirit of the Finance and Expenditure Committee. There's only a couple of minor amendments. I haven't bothered to go through them. I could take another 5-minute call, but I don't know that you'd allow me, Mr Chairman. In any case, I think the bill is largely intact as received back by the House, and I commit it to the House for its support.
Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member